Have you ever called your dog and watched him pause for just a second too long? Not completely ignore you, not walk away, just hesitate. His ear moves. He hears his name. His eyes lift toward you for a moment, but he doesn't come. And usually that's the exact moment people start feeling frustrated. The second call sounds a little firmer, a little sharper, because from the human side it feels simple. He heard me. So why isn't he listening? Some dogs do this so subtly that the pause barely lasts a second. But if you live with a dog, you probably know the feeling immediately. That strange moment where your dog looks aware of you, yet somehow distant at the same time. And most people explain it the same way: stubbornness, disobedience, ignoring commands. But sometimes the situation may be more complicated than that, because dogs do not experience social pressure the same way humans do. And in certain moments, what looks like refusing to listen may actually be hesitation, uncertainty, emotional overload, or conflict inside the dog itself. Not a lack of connection, not a lack of intelligence, just a reaction people often misunderstand. For most people, a dog responding to their voice feels like something deeper than obedience. It feels personal. You say the name, the dog turns, the dog comes closer, and over time, that small pattern starts feeling like proof of connection itself, which is why moments of hesitation can affect people more than they expect, especially at home, not during training outside, not at the park with distractions everywhere, but in quiet, everyday moments, in the kitchen, near the couch. At the end of the day, when the house feels calm, you call your dog, and instead of moving toward you, he pauses or looks away or stays exactly where he is. And something about that silence feels strangely emotional. Some dog owners notice these moments more as relationships deepen, not less. Because once people become emotionally attached to a dog, delayed responses stop feeling neutral. They start feeling meaningful, almost like rejection. And humans are naturally very quick to assign intention to behavior. If another person hesitates to respond to us, we often assume there is a reason behind it. So when a dog pauses too long, many people instinctively interpret that pause as a decision. He doesn't want to listen. He's being difficult. He knows exactly what he's doing. But dogs may not experience these moments with the same emotional logic humans project onto them. Sometimes the pause is not defiance. Sometimes the dog is uncertain or emotionally conflicted or trying to process too many signals at once. And once you start looking at the behavior that way, the entire moment can begin to feel very different. This is usually the point where people start saying things like, he knows that command. She's done this 1,000 times before. And very often, they're right. The dog really does know the cue. That's what makes the pause feel so confusing. You say a familiar word. The dog looks at you. Maybe the tail moves slightly. Maybe the ears shift forward. But the response comes slowly. A few seconds pass. Then maybe the dog finally walks over, or sits, or responds halfway without confidence. And because the command itself is familiar, many people assume the delay must be intentional. But behavior does not always slow down because a dog is refusing. Sometimes it slows down because the dog is emotionally overloaded. Dogs process more than words alone. They notice tone, facial tension, movement, repetition, timing. And when too many signals start stacking together, some dogs don't become more responsive, they become slower. You may have noticed this kind of hesitation gets stronger the more often a command is repeated. The first "come here" sounds neutral, the second sounds impatient. By the third or fourth repetition, the emotional pressure in the interaction has already changed. And sensitive dogs often react to that shift long before people realize it happened. So instead of speeding up, the dog may begin hesitating even more, not because the cue became unclear, but because the emotional atmosphere around the cue changed. Some dogs seem to freeze mentally for a moment in these situations, almost like they are trying to decide which response feels safest. And from the outside, that internal conflict can look almost identical to stubbornness, which is why so many owners misunderstand what they are seeing. For many dog owners, this may be the most confusing moment of all, because the dog is clearly aware of you. There's eye contact, the ears react. Sometimes the dog even shifts weight slightly forward, so from the human perspective, the situation feels obvious. He heard me. And that immediately creates the next question: then why isn't he coming? If you've lived with a dog for a long time, you probably recognize these strange suspended moments. The dog looks ready to move, but somehow stays still at the exact same time, almost like two different reactions are happening together. And in many cases, that may be surprisingly close to what the dog is actually experiencing. Behavior specialists sometimes describe this as conflict behavior, not aggression, not disobedience, internal conflict. Part of the dog may want to approach you, especially if the relationship itself feels safe and familiar. But another part of the dog may simultaneously feel uncertain about the emotional pressure surrounding the interaction. That pressure can come from many small things people barely notice: a sharper tone, repeated commands, direct staring, frustration in the voice, movement toward the dog. Humans often focus on the words themselves. Dogs often respond more strongly to the emotional atmosphere around the words, and once tension enters the interaction, some dogs begin hesitating between two opposite impulses: move closer or stay cautious, which can create that frozen looking pause people interpret as ignoring. But from the dog's side, the situation may feel much less clear than it appears to us, and the longer a person pushes in that moment, the harder the decision may become for certain dogs. Sometimes the reaction looks even more personal than hesitation. You call your dog, and instead of coming closer, he turns his head away. Maybe he suddenly looks at the floor, or toward the wall, or somewhere across the room that didn't seem important a second earlier. To many people, this feels almost deliberate, like avoidance, like the dog is choosing not to engage. And emotionally, that reaction can be surprisingly hard for owners to ignore, because eye contact means connection to humans. So when a dog breaks eye contact right after hearing a command, people often experience it as withdrawal. But canine communication does not always work that way. Dogs frequently use small body signals to reduce social tension, not to manipulate a situation, not to win, just to make the interaction feel calmer and safer. Behavior specialists often refer to these as calming signals, and many of them are incredibly subtle: looking away, turning the head slightly, blinking more slowly, sniffing suddenly, moving more carefully. You may have seen your own dog do something like this during emotionally tense moments without realizing what you were looking at, because from the outside, these signals appear quiet, almost insignificant. But for dogs, they can be part of emotional regulation, a way of softening pressure inside the interaction. And once people understand that, something important begins to shift. Certain behaviors that once looked disrespectful may actually be attempts to keep the situation peaceful. Not every dog uses these signals the same way, and not every delayed response is emotional, but sometimes a dog turning away is not the end of connection. Sometimes it is the dog trying very hard to protect it. At this point, the behavior usually stops feeling random. The pauses, the hesitation, the turning away, the moments where a dog seems emotionally stuck between responding and pulling back. And interestingly, researchers have studied how strongly dogs react to human emotional signals. A study connected to the University of Helsinki found that dogs change the way they look at human faces depending on emotional expression. In particular, dogs reacted differently to tense or threatening facial expressions than to calm ones. Dogs are highly sensitive to human emotional signals, and that matters more than many people realize because most owners focus mainly on the command itself. But dogs may also be reacting to tone, pressure, facial tension, repeated commands, or changes in emotional energy around them. Sometimes the emotional atmosphere shifts before the person even notices it, and sensitive dogs often notice those changes very quickly, which may help explain why some dogs suddenly slow down, freeze, or hesitate during moments that seem completely normal from the human side. Not because they stopped caring, but because emotionally the interaction may feel more intense to them than it does to us. Some reactions are so quiet that people barely register them at all. The dog doesn't run away, doesn't bark, doesn't resist. He simply stops moving. And because the behavior looks calm on the surface, it's often interpreted as stubbornness or lack of interest. But stillness in dogs is not always relaxation. Sometimes it can be hesitation under pressure, a kind of emotional pause. You may have seen moments like this before without thinking much about them. A dog standing in the hallway after being called, frozen near the doorway, looking toward the owner but unable to fully commit to moving forward. And from the outside, it can seem almost passive, but internally, the dog may be processing conflicting emotions very quickly. Approach, pause, approach again, stop. Not every freeze response comes from fear in the dramatic sense people imagine. Sometimes it comes from uncertainty, or overstimulation, or emotional confusion inside a socially tense moment. Dogs often communicate discomfort very quietly long before they communicate it loudly, and that may be one reason people miss these signals so easily. Humans tend to notice behavior once it becomes disruptive: barking, pulling away, growling. But quiet tension is harder to recognize, especially when the dog remains physically close. And once people begin understanding that stillness can sometimes be emotional, this is not just behavioral, the idea of ignoring starts becoming much more complicated, because in some moments, the dog may not be refusing to connect at all. He may simply not know how to move through the pressure he's feeling. One of the most frustrating patterns for owners is inconsistency. The dog responds perfectly one moment and seems completely disconnected the next. At home, the response is immediate. In the kitchen, slower. Late at night, almost effortless. But when visitors arrive or the environment becomes emotionally busy, the same dog suddenly appears to forget everything. And that inconsistency can make people assume the behavior must be intentional. Because if the dog understands the command sometimes, why not all the time? But dogs rarely experience communication in isolation. They do not separate words from atmosphere as easily as humans do. The emotional environment matters. The movement in the room matters. The predictability of the situation matters. Even subtle tension between people can matter. Some dogs become highly responsive when the environment feels stable and emotionally readable, then noticeably slower once the situation becomes socially complex. Guests entering the house, several people talking at once, unexpected movement, excited voices, changes in routine. You may have noticed your own dog behaving almost like a different animal depending on the emotional tone of the room, and that shift is often misunderstood as selective listening. But many dogs are not simply reacting to commands, they are reacting to context, to pressure, to stimulation, to uncertainty, to emotional pacing humans barely notice themselves, which is why the exact same cue can feel easy in one moment and emotionally difficult in another. Not because the dog stopped knowing the command, but because the surrounding atmosphere changed the way the dog experienced it. And this is usually the moment where the cycle quietly begins. The dog hesitates, the person becomes slightly more serious, the name gets repeated again, then maybe once more, not out of cruelty, not out of anger, just out of confusion. Because from the human side, it feels logical. If he heard me the first time, maybe I need to sound more firm. And most people don't even notice the emotional shift happening in their own voice. But dogs often do. The room becomes a little tighter emotionally. The pacing changes. The interaction feels less relaxed than it did a few seconds earlier, and sensitive dogs can start reacting to that pressure faster than people realize. So the dog slows down more. The person repeats the command again. The pressure rises again. And without meaning to, both sides begin influencing each other in ways neither fully understands. That is one reason these moments can become surprisingly emotional inside otherwise loving homes. Not because the relationship is bad, but because humans naturally interpret hesitation emotionally, while dogs may be responding emotionally at the exact same time for completely different reasons. You may have seen situations before that felt like stubbornness in the moment, but feel a little more complicated now looking back at them. And sometimes that shift in understanding changes the interaction almost immediately. Because once pressure begins decreasing, some dogs begin responding differently too. Not perfectly, not instantly, but more openly, more confidently, with less hesitation between hearing the voice and trusting the moment around it. For many dogs, the biggest change does not come from sounding more authoritative. It comes from making the interaction feel clearer and calmer. Sometimes even a short pause before repeating a command can change the entire emotional tone of the moment. Instead of filling the silence immediately, the person waits. The pressure stops building for a second. And that small pause often gives the dog more space to process what is happening. A calmer voice can matter too. Not overly cheerful, not robotic, just steady, because dogs are constantly reading emotional consistency, not only words themselves. And when commands are repeated too quickly, some dogs stop feeling guided and start feeling pressured, especially sensitive dogs, especially thoughtful dogs. You may have noticed that certain dogs respond better once the room itself feels quieter emotionally. Less tension, less urgency, less repetition. Sometimes clarity matters more than intensity. Simple routines can help as well. Predictable timing, familiar patterns, consistent reactions from the person. Not because dogs need perfection, but because predictability often reduces uncertainty. And when uncertainty decreases, hesitation sometimes decreases with it. This is not really about controlling a dog. It's more about creating an interaction the dog can move through without emotional conflict building inside it. Because in many cases, responsiveness grows more naturally when the dog feels safe enough to stay mentally open in the interaction. Of course, not every delayed response has a deep emotional meaning. Sometimes dogs really are distracted. Sometimes they are tired, interested in something else, less motivated in a particular moment. And sometimes a command is simply not as clear or as well practiced as people assume. But the important shift is this: not every pause is stubbornness, not every hesitation is defiance. Sometimes what looks like ignoring may actually be uncertainty, social pressure, emotional overload, or quiet internal conflict the dog does not know how to resolve yet. And once people begin noticing that difference, communication often starts changing in surprisingly gentle ways. The dog feels less pressured, the person feels less rejected, and small moments that once created frustration begin creating curiosity instead. You may start noticing tiny signals that were invisible before: the pause before movement, the change in breathing, the slight turn of the head, the moments where the dog seems emotionally unsure rather than resistant. And in many homes, that shift alone changes the atmosphere completely. Because understanding a dog is not only about teaching commands, sometimes it's about learning how emotional experiences shape behavior in ways that are easy to miss from the human side. And often, the more calmly people begin seeing those moments, the more connected the relationship itself starts to feel.